The incident with the New York reminded Lawrence Beasley of the Olympic Hawk incident 7 months earlier.
As we steamed down the river, the scene we had just witnessed was the topic of every conversation. The comparison with the Olympic Hawk collision was drawn in every little group of passengers, and it seemed to be generally agreed that this would confirm the suction theory, which was so successfully advanced by the cruiser Hawk in the law courts, but which so many people scoffed at when the British Admiralty first suggested it as the explanation of the cruiser ramming the Olympic. Second-class passenger, Lawrence Beasley.
The highest-paid captain on the sea was also highly modest.
When anyone asks me how I can best describe my experience in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say uneventful. Well, of course, there have been winter gales and storms and fog and the like, but in all my experience I've never been in any accident, or any sort worth speaking about. I've seen but one vessel in distress in all my years at sea. I never saw a wreck and never have been wrecked, nor was I ever in any predicament that threatened to end in disaster of any sort. You see, I'm not very good material for a story. Captain Edward J. Smith.
Fireman John Podesta recalls watching a fellow crewman desert Titanic at Queenstown.
All the White Star boats and Cunard liners outbound called here to pick up mails and passengers by tender, and it was the custom for we firemen and trimmers to go up on deck and carry the mails from the tender to the mail room. A fireman I knew very well, John Coffey, said to me, "Jack, I'm going down this tender to see my mother." He asked me if anyone was looking, and I said no and bid him good luck. A few seconds later he was gone. Fireman John Podesta.
Second Officer Lightoller is relieved for the night.
Murdoch, the first officer, took over from me in the ordinary way. I passed on the items of interest, as we called them: course, speed, weather conditions, ice reports, wished him joy of his watch, and went below. But first of all I had to do the rounds, and in a ship of that size it meant a mile or more of deck, not including a few 100 feet of ladders and staircases. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Even Titanic's experienced officers were amazed by her size.
It is difficult to convey any idea of the size of a ship like the Titanic, when you could actually walk miles along decks and passages, covering different ground all the time. I was thoroughly familiar with pretty well every type of ship afloat, from a battleship and a barge, but it took me 14 days before I could with confidence find my way from one part of that ship to another by the shortest route. A sailor does not walk around with a plan in his pocket. He must carry the ship in his head, and in an emergency such as fire must be able to get where he wants by sheer instinct, certainly without a chance of getting lost on the way. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Violet Jessup, a stewardess already familiar with the Olympic, was thrilled that designer Thomas Andrews asked some stewards how he could make Titanic even more comfortable than Olympic.
It was quite unusual for members of the catering department to be consulted about changes that would benefit their comforts or ease their toil. So when the designer, Thomas Andrews, paid us this thoughtful compliment, we realised it was a great privilege. Our esteem for him, already high, knew no bounds. Stewardess Violet Jessup.
Captain Smith's steward, James Paynton, described the near miss with the New York in a note to his parents.
Whether it was suction or what it was, I don't know. But the New York's rope snapped like a piece of cotton and she drifted against us. There was great excitement for some time, but I don't think there was any damage done bar one or two people knocked over by the ropes. Steward James Paynton.
Baker Reginald Burgess was in awe of Titanic's elegance.
Like the Olympic, yes, but so much more elaborate. Take the dining saloon. Olympic didn't even have a carpet, but the Titanic, you sank in it up to your knees. Then there's the furniture, so heavy you could hardly lift it. And that panelling. They can make 'em bigger and faster, but it was the care and effort that went into her. She was a beautiful, wonderful ship. Baker Reginald Burgess.
Stewardess Violet Jessup greeted Titanic's elite as they boarded.
It was not surprising when John Jacob Astor brought his bride of a year on board, about whom there had been so much publicity. Instead of the radiant woman of my imagination, one who had succeeded in overcoming much opposition and marrying the man she wanted, I saw a quiet, pale, sad-faced, in fact dull young woman arrived listlessly on the arm of her husband, apparently indifferent to everything about her. It struck me for the first time that all the wealth in the world did not make for inward contentment. Next appeared a delightful old couple, old in years and young in character, whom we were always happy to see join us. Mr. and Mrs. Strauss had grown old so gracefully and so together. Stewardess Violet Jessup.
Rumors of ice were circulating among the passengers.
Towards the evening, the report which I heard was spread that wireless messages from passing steamers had been received, advising the officers of our ship of the presence of icebergs and ice floes. The increasing cold and the necessity of being more warmly clad when appearing on deck were outward and visible signs in corroboration of these warnings. But despite them all, no diminution of speed was indicated and the engines kept up their steady running. First-class passenger, Archibald Gracie.
Captain Smith was a favorite among his officers.
Captain Smith, or EJ as he was familiarly and affectionately known, was quite a character in the shipping world. Tall, full-whiskered and broad. At first sight you would think to yourself, here's a typical Western Ocean captain. Bluff, hearty, and I'll bet he's got a voice like a foghorn. As a matter of fact, he had a pleasant, quiet voice and an invariable smile. He was a great favourite and a man any officer would give his ears to sail under. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Bruce Ismay was eager to show passengers how fast Titanic could go.
I was on deck in the afternoon of April 14th, between 5 and 6 o'clock. Mr. Ismay came up and inquired if our staterooms were comfortable and the service satisfactory, etc., and then thrust a marconigram at me, saying we were in among the icebergs. Something was said about the speed, and he said that the ship had not been going fast, but that they were to start up extra boilers that afternoon. The telegraph also spoke of the Deutschland, asking for a tow. And when I asked him what they were going to do about this, he said they had no time for such matters. Our ship wanted to do her best, and something was said about getting in Tuesday night. A strong impression on my mind was that they were speeding the ship up, to get away from the ice, and that we would probably get in late Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning. Mr. Ismay's manner was that of one in authority and the owner of the ship, and that what he said was law. First-class passenger Emily Ryerson.
Lightoller was notably impressed with the mechanics of the powerful Titanic.
After running our trials, we finally took over from the builders and proceeded round to Southampton. It was clear to everybody on board that we had a ship that was going to create the greatest stir British shipping circles had ever known. For one thing, she was the first ship to be fitted with a third screw, driven by a low-powered turbine. For manoeuvring, the 2 wing screws alone were used, but once clear of the land, steam from low-pressure cylinders was turned into this turbine, and undoubtedly it gave her a wonderful turn of speed. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Archibald Gracie attends to both body and soul on Sunday morning aboard Titanic.
When Sunday morning came, I considered it high time to begin my customary exercises, and determined for the rest of the voyage to patronize the squash racket court, the gymnasium, the swimming pool, etc. I was up early before breakfast and met the professional racket player in a half-hour's warming up, preparatory for a swim in the 6-foot deep tank of salt water heated to a refreshing temperature. In no swimming bath had I ever enjoyed such pleasure before. The exercise and the swim gave me an appetite for a hearty breakfast, then followed the church service in the dining saloon, and I remember how much I was impressed with the prayer for those at sea, also the words of the hymn which we sang, number 418 of the hymnal. First-class passenger, Archibald Gracie.
Passengers on the port side barely noticed the collision.
My mother felt this little bump, as she always described it, because we were a very long way from it. We were on the port side of the ship, and the collision was on the starboard side of the ship, and had she been asleep, it wouldn't have wakened her. My father went away and spoke to one of the sailors and came back and said, "We've hit an iceberg. They're going to launch the lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast." Second-class passenger Eva Hart.
Charlotte Collier watched Titanic disappear as she clutched her daughter Marjorie in Lifeboat 14.
Before the darkness came, I saw hundreds of human bodies clinging to the wreck or jumping into the water. Cries more terrible than I have ever heard rung in my ears. I turned my face away, but I looked round the next moment and saw the other half of the great ship slip below the surface of the water as easily as a pebble in a pond. I shall always remember that last moment as the most hideous of the whole disaster. Second-class passenger Charlotte Collier.
Seaman Joseph Scarrett told of Lifeboat 14's heartbreaking and nearly futile hunt for survivors in the water.
We were amongst hundreds of dead bodies floated in lifebelts. We could only see 4 alive. The first one we picked up was a male passenger. He died shortly after we got him in the boat. After a hard struggle, we managed to get the other 3. One of these we saw kneeling as if in prayer upon what appeared to be a part of a staircase. He was only about 20 yards away from us, but it took us half an hour to push our boat through the wreckage and bodies to get to him. Even then we could not get very close, so we put out an oar for him to get hold of and so pulled him to the boat. All the bodies we saw seemed as if they'd perished with the cold, as their limbs were all cramped up. As we left that awful scene, we gave way to tears. It was enough to break the stoutest heart. Seaman Joseph Scarrett.
Seaman Joseph Scarrett recalls returning to rescue surviving swimmers.
We tied all our boats together so as to form a large object on the water which would be seen quicker than a single boat by a passing vessel. We divided the passengers of our boat amongst the other 4, and then, taking one man from each boat so as to make a crew, we rowed away amongst the wreckage as we heard cries for help coming from that direction. Seaman Joseph Scarrett.
James Witter's life was saved by accident.
On my way to the upper deck, I met the second purser, who told me to clear the cabins of passengers and ensure that they all had life belts. This I did, then carried on to the upper deck and stood by number 11 boat, where I assisted the women and children to get on board. As the boat was about to be lowered, a hysterical woman tried to clamber into the boat, so I stood on the guardrail to assist her in. As she half fell into the boat, I went in with her. The boat was then being lowered. Steward James Witter.
Passengers in the first-class smoking room on A deck felt the collision.
There came a heavy grinding sort of a shock, beginning far ahead of us in the bows and rapidly passing along the ship and away under our feet. First-class passenger Hugh Woolner.
As Titanic was sinking, her officers prepared for the worst.
It was about this time that the chief officer came over from the starboard side and asked did I know where the firearms were. I told the chief officer, yes, I know where they are, come along and I'll get them for you. And into the first officer's cabin we went, the chief, Murdoch, the captain and myself, where I hauled them out, still in all their pristine newness and grease. I was going out when the chief shoved one of the revolvers into my hands with a handful of ammunition and said, "Here you are, you may need it." On the impulse, I just slipped it into my pocket, along with the cartridges, and returned to the boats. The whole incident had not taken 3 minutes, though it barely seemed worth that precious time. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Many passengers couldn't comprehend that their ship was actually sinking.
I'd made my way up the promenade deck where I saw 3 ladies arm in arm walking up and down. I said to them, I says, "You come along with me," I said. "The ship's sinking and we'll go up and see if there's any lifeboats left." She said, "We're all right, steward, the ship can't sink. We don't want to go down in one of those little boats." I left them and went up to the boat deck. Steward, Arthur Lewis.
Some women didn't realize they were leaving Titanic without their husbands until it was too late.
My husband put me on, and as he tried to join me, 2 policemen grabbed him as they wanted to save all the women and children first. I began yelling and crying, and I wanted to join him on the sinking ship. The boat was paddled away from the Titanic so fast that I couldn't jump off to be with my husband. Third-class passenger Salini Jaspek.
Jack Thayer was on the edge of a crowd that tried to avoid the rising water.
Now, without warning, she seemed to start forward,
moving forward and into the water at an angle of about 15 degrees. This movement, with the water rushing up toward us, was accompanied by a rumbling roar, mixed with more muffled explosions. It was like standing under a steel railway bridge while an express train passes overhead, mingled with the noise of a pressed steel factory and wholesale breakage of china. First-class passenger, Jack Thayer.
Winnie Trout immediately went to steerage to alert her friends of the danger.
I saw them lower one lifeboat with no one in it and noticed the men were also uncovering another. I then realised that something was the matter. I at once went to the staterooms of all my friends and told them to dress in case we were called up. Second-class passenger Edwina Trout.
In the sailors' haste to load the lifeboats, some families were torn apart.
A sailor caught Marjorie in his arms and tore her away from me and threw her in. She was not even given a chance to tell her father goodbye. I clung desperately to my husband. I heard him say, "Go, Lottie, for God's sake. Be brave and go. I'll get a seat in another boat." The men who held me rushed me bodily across the deck and hurled me into the lifeboat. Second-class passenger Charlotte Collier.
Titanic's passengers start to become aware that all is not well.
I dressed further and went up on the deck where I found several people, for the most part men, who were going and coming, and again an officer told me that there was no danger, that one could go back to bed. Instead of that, I went on the deck and went all the way to the front where I saw sailors getting into the boats at the top of the deck. From that time I was certain of our hazardous position. For a minute I felt faint, but soon I regained my composure. Second-class passenger Marie Gerouin.
Some desperate men tried anything to escape the sinking Titanic.
A man dressed as a woman jumped into the lifeboat as it was going down, and the officer said, "I've a good mind to shoot you. You might have capsized the boat." Second-class passenger Edith Brown.
One survivor's story proved Titanic's stern went down with no suction at all.
In the last few moments, those left behind made a mad rush toward what they considered a safer place, the poop deck. Fortunately, I was all alone when the big list of port occurred. I was able to straddle the starboard rail on A deck and stepped off as the ship went under. I had expected suction of some kind, but felt none. At no time was my head under water. Chief Baker, Charles Jowkin.
Anna Chaublon was one of many third-class passengers who could not find her way to the decks and lifeboats above.
The stairway was closed. It seems that those in charge were sure that the ship would be saved, and I suppose did not think it best to have more people above than necessary. Third-class passenger Anna Chaublon.
Second Officer Lightoller watched the water rise as he supervised the lowering of the port lifeboats.
Between one boat being lowered away and the next boat being prepared, I usually nipped along to have a look down the very long emergency staircase leading direct from boat deck down to sea deck. Actually built as a shortcut for the crew, it served my purpose now to gauge the speed with which the water was rising and how high it had got. By now, the foredeck was below the surface. That cold green water crawling its ghostly way up that staircase was a sight that stamped itself indelibly on my memory. Step by step it made its way up, covering the electric lights one after another, which for a time shone under the surface with a horribly weird effect. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Bruce Ismay defended his escape in collapsible lifeboat C.
I did not see anyone on deck, and I could only assume that the other passengers had gone to the other end of the ship. The boat was being actually lowered away. White Star Director, Bruce Ismay.
Charles Lightoller narrowly avoided the falling funnel.
The terrific strain of the after end of that huge hull clearing the water caused the expansion joint aft number 1 funnel to open up. The port wire parted to be followed almost immediately by the starboard one, giving this huge structure a pull over to that side of the ship, causing it to fall with its scores of tons right amongst the struggling mass of humanity already in the water. It struck the water between collapsible B and the ship, actually missing me by inches. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Laura Francatelli was told she would be safe, but she knew the ship was in trouble.
When I left my room, the water was on my deck, coming along the corridor. We were 20 feet above the water level, so we'd already sunk 20 feet. Everybody I passed assured me I was safe. First class servant, Laura Francatelli.
Dr. Washington Dodge was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right moment.
When boat number 13 was being lowered from the A-deck, it stayed there for at least 2 minutes, while the officers in charge were calling for more women and children. But as none responded, the officers said, "Some of you men tumble in," and I tumbled. First-class passenger, Dr. Washington Dodge.
Stewardess Violet Jessup left Titanic with a stranger's baby.
I turned to see young Mason, who'd been busy filling a boat. His face looked weary and tired, but he gave a bright smile as he ordered my group into the boat, calling out good luck as we stepped in, helped by his willing, guiding hand. Then he hailed me and held up something, calling as he prepared to throw it, "Look after this, will ya?" And I reached out to receive someone's forgotten baby in my arms. It started to whimper as I pressed it to me, the hard cork surface of the lifebelt being anything but a comfort. Poor mite. Stewardess Violet Jessup.
Jack Thayer, shivering on the swamped collapsible B, heard the voices of those still in the water after Titanic disappeared.
Probably a minute passed with almost dead silence and quiet. Then an individual called for help, from here, from there, gradually swelling into a composite volume of one long continuous wailing chant from the 1,500 in the water all around us. It sounded like locusts on a midsummer night in the woods in Pennsylvania. The terrible continuing cry lasted for 20 or 30 minutes, gradually dying away as one after another could no longer stand the cold and exposure. Practically no one was drowned, as no water was found in the lungs of those later recovered. Everyone had on a life preserver. The partially filled lifeboats standing by only a few hundred yards away never came back. Why on earth they did not come back is a mystery. How could any human being fail to heed those cries? First-class passenger, Jack Thayer.
As the ship was sinking, men who failed to follow the rules were dealt with severely.
A steerage passenger, an Italian, I think, came running the whole length of the deck and hurled himself into the boat. He fell upon a young child and injured her internally. The officer pushed him back onto the Titanic. I caught a last glimpse of this coward in the hands of about a dozen men. They were driving their fists into his face. Second-class passenger, Charlotte Collier.
Young Frank Prentice overhears a momentous conversation.
I happened to be up on the boat deck when I saw Thomas Andrews, the designer, Bruce Ismay, the chairman, and Captain Smith talking together. I heard Ismay say to Andrews, "What's the position? Is there any news?" And Andrews said, "Well, sir, the position is that she's going to sink. There's nothing that can stop us sinking. The water's just coming straight up. The bulkheads won't help her in any way at all." Assistant storekeeper, Frank Prentice.
One passenger helped save time, and perhaps more lives, by informing Captain Smith that the A-deck promenade's closed windows would keep passengers from boarding the lifeboats.
Upon noticing that the thick plate glass windows protecting the greater length of the promenade deck blocked egress, I walked up to Smith, saluted him, and said, "Excuse me, sir, but are you aware that all the windows on that deck are closed?" The captain, on hearing this, replied, "My God, you are right," and at once altered his orders, made the passengers assemble on the boat deck, and manned the boats from that deck. First-class passenger, Hugh Woolner.
Mrs. Johanna Stunk, a first-class passenger on the North German Lloyd liner Bremen, sailed past a fateful iceberg on April 20th, 1 week after the disaster.
It was between 4 and 5 o'clock on Saturday when our ship sighted off to bow to the starboard an iceberg. As we drew nearer and could make out small dots floating around in the sea, a feeling of awe and sadness crept over everyone, and the ship proceeded in absolute silence. Looking down over the rail, we distinctly saw a number of bodies so clearly that we could make out what they were wearing, and whether they were men or women. We saw one woman in her nightdress, with a baby clasped closely to her breast. Several of the women passengers screamed and left the rail in a fainting condition. There was another woman, fully dressed, with her arms tight around the body of a shaggy dog that looked like a Saint Bernard. The bodies of 3 men in a group, all clinging to one steamer chair, floated close by, and just beyond them were a dozen bodies of men, all in life preservers, clinging together as though in the last desperate struggle for life. Those were the only bodies we passed near enough to distinguish, but we could see the white life preservers of many more, dotting the sea all the way to the iceberg. Bremen first-class passenger Johanna Stunk.
Like so many Southampton children, Dorothy Cross grew up hearing stories of the Titanic.
My grandmother was a headmistress at Grove Street School. I remember the story my mother told. She was visiting my grandmother and they went into this one class and grandmother said, "Stand up, any child who has a relative on the Titanic," and the whole class stood up. And one little mite said, "Oh, there's no need to worry, miss, the Olympic is rushing to her aid." And I thought that's the trust of a child, isn't it? You know. Southampton resident Dorothy Cross.
The first time I really let it into my heart was after the dive, sitting in the room by myself. I had brought some music with me that was just meant to evoke the story, and I'd put that on, and the images started playing back through my head of the boat deck and the davit still sitting there that had launched Lifeboat 1. I thought about all the people huddled there on that part of the deck, right where our submersible was sitting. At the very last second, as the bridge rail went underwater and the Atlantic poured over it like a wave and washed those people away, what they must have felt. For me, it was such a dark epiphany to realize that I now was connected to a tragic event in which so many people died.
Lightoller explains how testifying in the British investigation was a bit trickier than in the American inquiry.
In Washington, it was of little consequence, but in London it was very necessary to keep one's hands on the whitewash brush. Sharp questions that needed careful answers if one was to avoid a pitfall, carefully and subtly dug, leading to a pinning down of blame onto someone's luckless shoulders. How hard Mr. Scanlon and the legal luminary representing the interests of the seamen and firemen tried to prove there were not enough seamen to launch and man the boats. The same applied to the passengers, and quite truly, but it was inadvisable to admit it then and there, hence the hard-fought verbal duels between us. Mr. Scanlon's aim was to force the admission that I had not sufficient seamen to give adequate help with the boats, and consequently that the ship was undermanned. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.
Francis Dyke, working aboard the Minia, wrote to his mother about finding bodies.
"We began the search yesterday, and the first we picked up was C.M. Hayes of Grand Trunk Rail. It was no trouble to identify him, as he had a lot of papers on him, and a watch with his name. We picked up 10 more bodies yesterday, waiters and sailors. All those who are identified are embalmed and packed in ice, and are to be sent to New York. I can tell you none of us like this job at all, but it is better to recover them and bury them properly than let them float about for weeks. The Reverend Cunningham came out with us to bury those not identified. When we passed over the spot where the Titanic sank, he held a short service in the saloon, which I thought to be very nice of him. I expected to see the poor creatures very disfigured, but they all look as calm as if they were asleep. Many a seaman, Francis Dyke."
In the film, those are the real doors, just as they sit on the bottom of the ocean. So I wanted to explore them, but the dog reached the end of his leash, so he turned around and came back. We came up through the stairwell and we went into the B-deck level and got to Suite B51. J.P. Morgan was booked into that suite but canceled before sailing, and it was taken over by the Cardeza party. We didn't really know what to expect. We saw the bronze sconces still on the walls and the bronze trim around the windows. I said to Jeff, "Turn left, let's see if the fireplace is there." So the camera comes around, and it was just sitting there with the marble on each side and the wood uprights of the hearth. Here we are, deep in the heart of the ship, and we're feeling like we've gone into King Tut's tomb or something.
Archibald Gracie watched Carpathia's slow approach to the rescue.
It was at quite an early stage that I had seen far in the distance the unmistakable mast lights of a steamer about 4 or 5 points away on the port side. My eyes were fixed for hours that night on the lights of that steamer far away in the distance, which afterwards proved to be those of the Carpathia. To my great disappointment, they seemed to make no progress towards our rescue. This, we were told later, was due to meeting an iceberg as she was proceeding full speed toward the scene of the Titanic's wreck. She had come to a stop in sight of the lights of our lifeboats, or such as had them. Finally, dawn appeared, and there on the port side of our upset boat, where we had been looking with anxious eyes, glory be to God, we saw the steamer Carpathia about 4 or 5 miles away, with other Titanic lifeboats rowing towards her. First-class passenger Archibald Gracie.
We called our remotely operated vehicle Snoop Dogg because he was on this long leash and his job was to snoop around inside the wreck. So we shine our sublights down into this big yawning pit that goes down 5 decks into the ship. It was the stairwell of the forward first-class grand staircase. Then we sent the ROV down, all the way down to D deck. Unfortunately, the staircase itself is gone. It was thought by previous expeditions that the glory of the interior of Titanic was gone, so we really didn't know what to expect. The first thing we see is a perfectly preserved, hand-carved oak column. There it is, right in front of our eyes. We just went crazy. This was beyond our hopes.
In spite of his injuries, Harold Bride went back to work as soon as possible.
I guess I lay in the hospital until near night, when they told me the Carpathia's wireless man was acting queer, and would I help. After that, I was never out of the wireless room. Marconi wireless operator, Harold Bride.
After having told reporters that Titanic was unsinkable, White Star President Philip Franklin was forced to tell them that she had sunk.
Immediately when that telegram was received by me, it was such a terrible shock that it took us a few minutes to get ourselves together. Then at once I telephoned myself to 2 of our directors, Mr. Steele and Mr. Morgan, Jr., and at the same time sent downstairs to the reporters. I got off the first line and a half where it said, "The Titanic sank at 2:00 a.m." And there was not a reporter left in the room. They were so anxious to get out and telephone the news. White Star Line Vice President Philip Franklin.
Thayer failed in his attempt to relieve a distraught Bruce Ismay.
Because I had known Ismay so well on board the Titanic, the doctor of the Carpathia, the afternoon that we approached New York, asked me if I would not visit Mr. Ismay in his cabin and talk to him, to see if I could not help relieve the terribly nervous condition he was in. I immediately went down, and as there was no answer to my knock, I went right in. He was seated in his pajamas on his bunk, staring straight ahead, shaking all over like a leaf. My entrance apparently did not dawn on his consciousness. Even when I spoke to him and tried to engage him in conversation, telling him that he had a perfect right to take the last boat, he paid absolutely no attention and continued to look ahead with his fixed stare. I am almost certain that on the Titanic his hair had been black with slight tinges of gray, but now his hair was virtually snow white. I have never seen a man so completely wrecked. Nothing I could do or say brought any response. As I closed the door, he was still looking fixedly ahead. First-class passenger Jack Thayer.